Good luck.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lat Mackey, and this is Sequence Break, episode 54 with TiKevin83. Kevin, thank you so much for being here. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Lat Mackey, for having me. And 54, that's a lot of episodes. That's great.
You know, it's over a year now, and I honestly don't know where the time has gone. So, yes, exactly. TiKevin for the win. Couldn't agree with you more, Big Bass. Or Big Bass, depending on... I never know if it's Bass or Bass, but anyway.
That's my friend Big Bass. He joins my streams pretty often.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad we got a chance to meet for the GDQ stuff just a month or two ago. And you are maybe perhaps one of the most passionate Pokemon people in speedrunning and all that kind of stuff. But if somebody wasn't familiar with you, how would you say that you're kind of affiliated with speedrunning? What are some of the things you've done here in the community?
Like more historically, I was really big in getting the routing of Pokemon Yellow to where it is today. I did a lot of the RTA runs initially when the in-game time to RTA timing switch happened, and kind of perfected that route. So a lot of the people doing Pokemon Yellow speedruns now are using that routing that we did back in 2017. And then since then, with continuing to do TAS research, I've continued finding strats that are used in various Pokemon Gen 1 speedruns.
That is awesome. You're also part of the TASBot team. And if I'm getting this correctly, you've created some of the tools that TASBot is currently using. Is that accurate?
Kind of, yeah. More accurate that I've kind of paired together a lot of different tools that people have made and kind of created that whole ecosystem, and not just there's this thing here and this thing here, but really the whole pipeline of how to do the task verification.
Well, I'm excited to get to talk all about it, but I thought it might be interesting if we break this up a little bit and first talk a little bit about you to kind of understand your history and some of the things that brought you up in gaming. So where did you get your start? What was some of the first games you ever played as a kid growing up?
Oh man, I could definitely mention a few things. Whenever that topic comes up for me, it brings a lot of really strange memories. Do you have any memories like that when you're playing a game as a really young kid and you don't really understand words yet, and so when you go back and play it again, it's I didn't understand any of what was actually happening in this game, right?
Absolutely.
So
Go ahead.
I think some of the actual games were I think they were Atari 2600 games.
Oh wow!
But I'm not entirely sure because my dad also was running emulators even back in the 90s to play arcade games.
Wow!
He was on the cutting edge of MAME, and so we were doing Elevator Action and Donkey Kong Jr. on a Mac in the late 90s.
Oh dang!
With MAME.
That is bleeding edge. I mean, I don't. Okay, so I probably found emulators probably in the 90s because I was one of those kids who we had a modem in our house and we were on the internet very young, which is pretty awesome for seeing some of this stuff. But MAME, I wouldn't even have thought of MAME. The first thing I wanted to do was Nintendo. How do I get my Nintendo on my computer? Which is because that's a whole down the rabbit hole type of thing. I'm glad you mentioned about those memories because they're not always kind of concrete as a kid. One of the first games I remember originally playing was Faxanadu, and it has a fair amount of text. If you ever played, it's an RPG from early 8-bit Nintendo. And but you're right, I don't remember exactly the story or anything like that. I just remember the feelings that it evoked, right? The nostalgia part.
Right. Yeah. So my dad was really an arcade gamer. He never really got into any of the console gaming. Wow. For him, gaming was I would go to this place and I would play games with other people in an arcade. But then the arcade ecosystem died in a lot of smaller towns where I am. So he really stopped gaming, but then he had some of those nostalgia memories, and so he put them on various computers we had for emulation, and that's how I kind of got introduced to gaming.
It's something we haven't actually talked about too much on this podcast is the arcade scene. And one of the things that there was a comic book shop down the street from my house that had a couple of arcade games, one of them being Mortal Kombat 2, the popular Mortal Kombat, I'm sorry, the original as well. And there was this really great social aspect about arcades and things like that I really, the memory, obviously, I'm very fond of it and everything like that. It's got the nostalgia, it's got the whole thing with it. But I forget how many people there were out there who were, man, the arcade was their thing. The console, that's a watered down arcade, that kind of thing. I don't know if it was that antagonistic, but a very interesting kind of difference between the arcade and console gaming back then,
Yeah, for sure.
What were some of your favorite arcade games then, growing up?
We would play Galaga, I think it's called, and Galaxian. and elevator action was one that was really common. Are
People
you familiar with that one?
speedrun. Yeah, no, yeah. Well, somebody I know speedruns it. Elevator, the opponent, and so I'm familiar with the speedrun of it. I never actually played it in the arcade, but is it fun?
It is a really interesting. Like, I love the amount of complexity there is to it, even for like an early game like that, because there's this whole system of being able to like shoot lights down to knock enemies down, or you can directly shoot the enemies, and having like multiple ways of defeating enemies like that is a lot of variety for such an early game.
Yeah, no kidding. So you could devise strategies and all that kind of stuff based around it too. It sounds like as you're pumping in the quarters.
Yeah.
So when did we're going to talk about when do you discover Pokemon? When does Pokemon become a thing? What was like the first Pokemon game you might have already first had?
I remember my parents not wanting to get me Pokemon for a long time, but I eventually, what's the word? Wore them down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometime around like 3rd or 4th grade. So when I was like 9, which must have been like the early 2000s. So like by the time that the like Fire and Leaf Green, or maybe it was more like the Ruby Sapphire era, that Gen 3 era, I was still playing like the Gen 1 games. So I was playing like Pokemon Yellow and getting introduced to that era of Pokemon.
I mean, was Game Boy or Game Boy Color? What was like your first handheld console?
We first had one of those bricks, like the original giant brick Game Boy.
Oh wow, yeah.
So I was playing Pokemon Yellow like the way it wasn't even like intended, because it's got all the colors for it. And then eventually we got a Game Boy Color, and then at some point my brother and I both got Game Boy Advances, and then you could still play the Game Boy games on them.
Yeah, it's one of the great. I probably play my Game Boy Advance. I mean, still to this day because of the reverse compat. Like I it's my preference when I play Game Boy games and things like that because of that specifically. I'm curious what your like first experience was playing through Yellow and things like. So just to bring you up to speed where I'm at, I just finished my first playthrough of a Pokemon game last night. Literally happened at midnight last night, and so I'm kind of discovering this. I know and I'm not sure why I missed it. I think I was just a tad too old for the cartoons. I think I was just getting it. Like Batman was coming out around this time too. So I think I got more into like Batman and Turtles and things like that. And for some reason, I just slightly missed Pokemon. But such a wonderful game. What was the things that hooked you in as a kid playing that for the first time?
It was really interesting to me, the like sort of open world aspect. Like it's not even considered an open world game these days, right? But I was used to playing games like Donkey Kong Jr., where like there's a level and there's only a couple things you can do. You can go like right on the vines, and then you can go left, and then you finish the level, and then that's it, right? So it felt very like much more like an open world game to me, and there's like a lot of exploration where like you're not exploring anything when you're playing Donkey Kong and jumping over barrels or swinging on vines.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the first things I noticed after I got through the Elite Four and I got through the Champion, and I was just thinking, man, I could go through this game with almost an unlimited variety in my party or in my actions that I'm going to take or in the things that I bring to each individual fight. And I'm thinking for a Game Boy game, it's still blowing my mind to think about the small amount of space that they have in there, and that they created this system can be as complex as you want it. It's really quite fascinating.
Yeah. And the best example that I can remember of like the difference between being a child in that sort of environment and now is like the Mount Moon experience. So like as a kid going through Mount Moon, there's like tons of different ladders. You can hardly see where you're going. You don't know what to do to get through the end. I remember like going on IGN in like the early days of the internet trying to find guides of like how to get through Mount Moon. Right?
Yes.
But now it's like it's the polar opposite. You think of it and it's like, oh, it's so easy. You just go here to here and you just go here to here and then you're through the tunnel. And it takes like 3 or 4 minutes, right? So, but
also, if you're streaming it, you can help. Twitch chat can help you out getting through these things.
Oh, right. Yeah,
guides, right?
Playing casually.
You
got that interactive feedback.
Absolutely, and I completely appreciate what you're saying. And there were times where I struggled with differentiating some things visually because of the 8-bit nature that is Game Boy and stuff like that. But it didn't get in the way of the enjoyment and the complex systems that the game has to offer. We're going to return to it in just a second. I'm curious about then how you kind of discovered speedrunning and then how you got into, where did you go from like childhood gaming into speedrunning later on in life?
Yeah, so I think it was kind of organic out of how I played Pokemon, because when I was playing Pokemon as like a middle schooler or high schooler, it was trying to like build out a complete Pokedex. I was very like completionist in how I'd play games back then.
Nice.
But then it kind of morphed into more of the speedrunning naturally, because in order to get like multiple legendaries out of one cartridge, you might have to reset a game and then go through and pick the other legendary or pick the other starters. Like if you wanted to get all three of the starters, you're gonna have to do 3 playthroughs of Pokemon Ruby or Sapphire, right?
Right.
So what I ended up doing is I ended up like writing speedrun routes before having any understanding of even what speedrunning was, because I wanted to be able to reset these games more optimally and get through them quickly to be able to like build up the decks more quickly.
Wow. Had you, I mean, if you don't, around what time period is this? Like, is the internet a thing? Have you gone and did you look for research on this, or is this something you just started?
This was like before there was really a Pokemon speedrunning community. So there were like strategies out there that you could go watch on like SDA forum, I think it was. But those were like really unoptimal. So even playing yourself, you could realize like this isn't something that would work very well if you're actually trying to play an RTA. Like it might be like a theory task that you're watching or some other like weird segmented run. The SDA, there's a lot of segmented runs on old SDA forums.
That was a big thing, was the segmented runs.
Mm-hmm. So like going through that, I was kind of like adjacent to the speedrunning scene, but I didn't really know other people in it, and there wasn't a community around doing real-time speedruns of Pokemon games yet. So it was just something I was doing as a side effect of trying to build up a Pokedex.
And I mean, what kind of project was it to take on to actually find all, capture all, and actually, with different starters going through and getting all the Pokemon? That had been quite a task.
I mean, I have a copy of Diamond where I tried to get a complete, what do you call it? Is it national dex or something? Where you have like all the Pokemon across all the regions. Yeah. And it has like 180 hours on it, but that's only counting the Diamond hours.
Dang.
So,
wow.
that doesn't account for like you had to play through Coliseum to get all the Gen 2 Pokemon in that ecosystem to trade them over to the Game Boy Advance games, and then you had to play through Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald and Fire Red and Leaf Green, right?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because excuse me, one of the people in chat was mentioning how Coliseum and how you can take your Pokemon with you basically through the generations and stuff. And I'm actually kind of looking forward to that, but it's kind of a process. I didn't realize that Coliseum was the way that you'd have to do that. I wasn't quite sure. And I don't know. I mean, I played it on the actual cartridge, and that was one of those things. I was like, oh man, I could take it with me, but I don't know. Have a flash carts or anything made that any simpler or easier, or is it still the process you need to go through Coliseum at that generation to move your Pokemon
if you want to get everything in Gen 4, I think they might have done stuff with like Heart Gold and Soul Silver to make that easier, but I think if you want everything in Gen 3, it's like if you want like a complete Emerald deck, right, then you have to do everything in like Coliseum and Coliseum XD and Fire Red Leaf Green and all that stuff.
Got it. So what would you consider then perhaps maybe the first like RTA run that you might have completed for any Pokemon game? Which game was it?
That must have been more like when I was in 2016. I was in college and I had been following Twitch more because of I was actually into League of Legends at the time. I was really into like more competitive gaming. Mm-hmm. And from that, I was watching Twitch a lot because they had so much streaming of different League of Legends streams. And
still do.
From watching Twitch. Oh yeah, certainly. You'll still today find tons of people watching League on Twitch, right? So, but from being on Twitch a lot, I got introduced to more like Pokemon streamers, and then that introduced me to the like Pokemon speedrunning scene. So at that point, I decided, well, if I'm gonna do a stream, that's what I want to start out with. And so I started with Pokemon Yellow because that was the game I had the most familiarity with from a speedrun perspective of like. How much I was familiar with it compared to the speedrunning route was like linked up best, I guess.
No, that's an interesting point. And it's not the first time that somebody has mentioned, a speedrunner has mentioned that they came from the competitive scene. I remember Thab the Beast was talking about coming from League of Legends. And I'm curious if like the speedrunning thing, does it hit that like same competitive itch, even though it may not necessarily be with somebody else, it's more against yourself and things like that. But I'm wondering how that, it's interesting how one leads to another.
Yeah, I felt like it hit it even better than League in some ways, because League was, and still is probably, really bad at like, you have to play it way more than even necessarily your skill level to start trying to advance, because there's so many people playing it, right? If you want to like make yourself stand out and the millions of people playing it, you're gonna have to play it even more than the other millions of people. So it's really crazy the amount of time investment compared to like you might already even be a good player. You might be like one of the better league players, and you can't even show it because you have to get through all those levels of playing for years and years and years to start denoting it.
It's interesting.
So
go ahead. No, finish.
Yeah. So I felt like when I was getting into the speedrunning scene that it was a way better like satisfying the competitive itch, because you could like immediately directly compete against the top people if you put in the effort.
That's a really interesting point about the barrier to entry. And I wonder if that's, so I've never played League, and it's something that I think is interesting, and I'd like to, because of all, there's a lot of complex strategy, just like in, any type of competitive gaming. But to your point, I've always felt like this is what happens when I go and I'll play Overwatch something. I'll get destroyed pretty quick because it's not a game I play very often, and the skill gap in real time, is just you get destroyed, and so that's a really good point about having access. The speedrunning gives you that chance to actually learn the thing.
Yeah. And it's not like there's some book that you can go read and immediately be good at League, right? You can't just like do that. But with speedrunning, there's a lot more of that, where like people have written these routes and you can read a book and then be just like you have all the knowledge you need to know to beat this game as fast as possible, because of how like the communities work and sharing their strategy. And I really enjoy that aspect of speedrunning.
I loved how you mentioned that, you started routing and doing these things to figure out the most effective and efficient way to get through, a given starter or a different generation of the game. When did you start tinkering then with maybe glitching or playing with the way that the game can be manipulated outside of just routing a game?
So that started happening around the time of the RTA switch. So originally, when we were doing Pokemon speedruns, when I was just getting into it, it was around the end of the era where we were timing by the like in-game timer that the game displays at the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
And when we switched to the RTA scene, it was then viable to reset the game during runs. It was before then not allowed to do that, because then your time that during the reset isn't counted in the in-game time at the end of the run. So now that you're allowed to do these in-game resets, it then became possible to do more with like manipulating the fine details of glitches and RNG.
So as I've been doing the research for some of this, I hear this quite often about before we started in-game, during the in-game timing and now switching over to the RTA. What led to that discussion? Like, could you take us through that a little bit, like how that came about and why that happened?
I think the switch happened mostly just because of like accuracy and trying to delineate who was actually the best, because the games are getting routed so well that a lot of people were able to get that top in-game time. And then with having like 5 or 10 people who all have the best in-game time, now you want to be able to compete again, right? You want to have that this person has the world record, and you can't show that so much now because 5 people have the best time if you have the in-game time.
That's okay. That's a great point. And that's, it's so interesting that I love that so many communities have gotten to that place where you want that fidelity in your timing, that kind of specificity, because in many games, times can be differentiated by seconds or milliseconds. Like, it's gotten so competitive nowadays. And it sounds like that's what happened with the Pokemon community.
Exactly. And it even now, it was just the other day, somebody got a speedrun of Pokemon Yellow that was like 35 frames off of the world record.
Oh my gosh.
And we were able to time that because we've put in all those ecosystems to be able to watch down to the second in real time instead of worrying about the in-game time of the run.
When did you start dabbling with tasking the game or throwing, using tools to perhaps find new things and play with different? And what game was it? Which generation did you attack first?
Yeah, so what happened is with Pokemon Yellow, I was doing a lot of that routing and RTA playing, and I hit a point once where I was satisfied where I was at with my time in Yellow, but while I was doing those runs, I found a glitch with the intro sequence where you could set all of your options at the same time by pressing the left button at the same time that you press A to open the options menu. I just randomly discovered this glitch one day, and I wanted to see it incorporated into the tasks. I guess I should explain too that I had gotten a little bit more familiar with the task side of things already, just like as part of being around the Pokemon speedrunning community and people mentioning it throughout the years. So between like 2016 and early 2018, I was doing that RTA stuff, and then in early 2018, I found that glitch and wanted to incorporate it into the tasks that I'd already been introduced to, or start building tasks for things that hadn't even been done yet, like the glitchless tasks that I've started getting more familiar with.
When you discover something like that, what kind of impact does that have? I mean, is that why and how is that changing the game? This is where I'm going to be honest. I'm not too familiar, or at least I don't know enough to understand why that affects the game the way it does.
Yeah. So the importance with this one was whenever you're doing a manipulation for like a starter or another thing you might want to like encounter in Pokemon, and this happens. This is more relevant to Gen 2, and it's kind of a coincidence that this bug that I found also affects Gen 2 and not just Gen 1, because a lot of the code is copied between the games. But
interesting.
It is really interesting that it worked out this way. But this glitch that I found allows you to have more variance in ways that you can change the RNG. So it actually enables you to find faster manipulation setups for various Pokemon, because it's another tool you'll have in your toolbox to change where the RNG is.
Okay, so I got to ask, just because it happened recently. So I just finished going through the Elite Four and Crystal and the Champion. So this next part, is it a copy and paste job then from Gen 1? Like, or did they have to do, did they have to do some work to actually get it to work that way?
I mean, it's a little bit of both, right? Okay. There's a lot of it that's a copy and paste job, but then there's a lot of like stitching that you have to do to get the engines to run together.
Got it. Okay. Wow, that's fascinating. So what? I mean, I guess this is the thing where I find just fascinating, and I'd love to know how it happens, because there are things that RTA runners are figuring out. There are things that tool-assisted speedrunners are figuring out. And at some point, you both want to incorporate them into your work. Like, are people working in conjunction in this way, or is it things just being shared freely? I'm curious about the history a little bit. How is some of these things getting shared between the communities and between people?
Yeah, I would say in general that the tasking scene is very individualistic, and it's not so much because they have any, or I too, right? Like, it's not so much that we have any objection to sharing strategy, but a lot of people in task scene just prefer to work independently, right. And so their work kind of more diffuses slowly into communities as they see the tasks and read the write-ups about how the tasks work, and not so much immediate sharing. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of one of the things I've been working on improving as part of getting into the tasking scene, is building those ties so that the people who are working on tasks are more comfortable hanging out in the RTA discords and vice versa, so that information flow is more direct and not so much that like over time diffusion.
In the early couple episodes of this podcast, had Memory Task, had Duango AC, all these taskers, and they did a really good job of kind of giving us some insight into, and this doesn't speak for the entire community, obviously, but that there's people who tend to be introverts and enjoy the idea of tinkering with this stuff, individually, as you're saying. So, and it's just their process. And I think that that's so interesting because, first of all, it takes a long time. It's meticulous, and it's such a time-consuming type of thing. When you've done your own tasking, I mean, it could take months, it seems like, at times.
For sure, yeah. Especially the first time that you task a game, or anybody has tasked a game, is an entirely different kind of like obstacle than rewriting it. Because if you've written it once, you have this template of like, okay, this input should go around here. Maybe it could go a little bit earlier or later if I've optimized things a little bit. Right. But it's got to be around here at least. And like the general structure of how the whole game needs to go at that point. But the first time, you have to do all the sort of like, well, what if I move this gym to this point in the run and then I have this experience level? And then what if I delay this to here? What if I get a rare candy? Is using that rare candy going to benefit me enough battles to make it worth using right away? Or is it worth just like having extra turns on a couple of these battles here where I'm lower level in order to not have to go out of my way to get the rare candy? And so there's all those moving pieces, and it's crazy because like You would think you could just like hit a button and a formula could solve the whole thing in tasks, right?
If only.
It's just the perfect speed run, right? You can just hit a button and know all of it. But no, it's so complicated that the number of atoms in the universe doesn't even describe the level of complexity of the options you have, right? There's no way to actually make the perfect task. So there's this sort of like human ingenuity to the routing that is still necessary to toggle all of those levels.
Okay, so when I first booted up BizHawk, I was expecting the miracle button. Oh, I do my input and that's the game's just gonna work. Oh my gosh, the variety of the amount of options you have in BizHawk, it was intimidating. I'll be honest with you. When I was just trying to figure out a way to get past a certain thing of a game I was speedrunning. I wanted to do frame by frame, but I was intimidated to say the least by all the things you can do at once. Excuse me. So that's really cool. There is something though that you hit upon I think is really important, like this idea of discovery can still have, RTA runners, people who love breaking games and things like that. When we discover something, the mind just, oh my gosh, it feels like the world has just gotten bigger. The same thing can happen. And it seems like this keeps happening in Pokemon where somebody who's tasking something discovers something brand new and you've had it yourself. What's it like to discover some of that? What are some of the discoveries that have really sparked your creativity?
Yeah, the one that immediately comes to mind is that options one. Mm-hmm. There's the benefit with the variance and manipulation, but there's also a benefit of you actually just need to set your options in Gen 1, right? You want to make your text speed faster, right. You want to turn off animations, and you can do all that at once. But the immediate effect when I found it was like just one of bewilderment because I had no context for that sort of thing being possible. And so I was just like confused. I just sat there. If you go back and watch the VOD of me finding that I clipped, it's not like me being excited. It's just me being confused for 30 seconds. Like, what just happened? I don't understand. How are my options set like this? That's not supposed to be possible. Re-roll the tape.
How cool though that you got that on stream. That's great. Like not all these discoveries are on video somewhere. So man, it's so cool.
No, not necessarily.
Little did you know you were just breaking the game.
Yeah, I think you can see the same kind of thing. There was a classic one that Pokemon speedrunner Swaff has a video of where he gets instant text. He's the guy who found the instant text glitch in Pokemon Gen 1, and it's the same thing. It was a complete accident. There was absolutely no like intention in this. He went to the bike shop because he like made a mistake. He thought he was in a different part of the run randomly and went to the bike shop to get the bike before it's supposed to be possible. And then he goes to Misty and he's like bewildered because his text is running so fast. And it's not like he's like excited because he found this glitch. He's just really, really confused what's going on.
I love that. Oh, don't even know what you're about to just start. So I'm going to... As we talk more and more about Pokemon, I may be asking the question incorrectly or not quite getting at the heart of what the issue may be. So please, if you want to take us in a different direction, please do, because I'm very new to this and still learning a lot about it, but I'm fascinated by all of this. You mentioned something about Gen 1 Pokemon. So let's say you find something on a red cartridge, is it going to work the same on, on the same, Gen 1 but on different cartridges? Like, are there different versions? Are those things, do they get applied to the full generation variety?
Yeah, the red and blue are so similar that they are almost entirely the same.
Okay.
The only differences are in like coloration and some really minor other things like micro timings that it would be difficult to explain in the course of a podcast. So like you have different RNG between the two games. But beyond that, and a couple of like what Pokemon you can get in which grass places, there's virtually no difference between the two games.
Okay.
Then you go to yellow, and a lot of red and blue still applies to yellow, but not everything. So you got to be careful there. And there's a couple things, like another glitch that I found. I could get back a little bit to the previous question too, with what the glitches that I was really like excited to find and bewildered by was I was doing some different task attempts of Pokemon Yellow no save corruption, and one of the revisions just randomly was 30 frames faster through the intro, and I didn't know why. Right, I just like, okay, what is different in this one compared to this one that could make it possibly just be randomly 30 frames faster. And so we combed over it, and me and a couple of the other guys in the Pokemon speedrunning programming channel, and we found that there was a different animation when you were going into the Pikachu cutscene with Oak, where Oak in Pokemon Yellow, they wanted to be a little more direct about teaching you how Pokemon are caught and encountered. So they have this thing where when you go to the grass the first time, not only does Oak tell you that it's dangerous, he goes through this little tutorial of like catching the Pikachu that shows up. And it goes a little bit more into the anime too, where, and I think that happens in the anime a similar way, where Oak catches a Pikachu for Ash.
So I'm first of all, I'm glad they actually did that, and I'm assuming as I go on with my Pokemon journey, it's going to get a little bit better and better, because that was the one thing that I was a bit critical about, was knowing all of the types and how they relate to each other and what is weak and what it's. Just to share a little bit about my story, I come from a very traditional. First games I played were Final Fantasies and these traditional RPGs where I've got my team. I'm going to heal. Everyone's got their own roles. But with Pokemon, it as much as I think it's such a wonderful way to enter into trying out an RPG, because it's simplistic yet just incredibly deep, and it can be as complicated as you want, But not knowing some of those like things, I would, especially right up front, I would have liked to know a little bit more about how each relates and what's weak. And it's in Game Boy, I know there's certain they didn't have enough. There's only a certain amount of data they could actually give us.
Yeah. So the example here for the differences between red and blue and yellow is that they added this little bit to the cutscene. And then from the glitching perspective, what happened is when they added this cutscene, they forgot that you don't have a Pokemon yet. So there's some routines that happen in a battle that say like, what is your Pokemon's level? What is your opposing Pokemon's level? And then so how dramatic is this battle going to be? How dramatic do I want to make the animation going into the battle based on the levels of the two Pokemon? Which is just like mind-blowingly complex that they thought about that when programming this game. That's so cool that they even thought about that.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's broken here because you don't have a Pokemon. So when it goes and checks what your first Pokemon's level is, it starts doing things that are not defined. Like the developers didn't intend for you to be in that part of memory at that point. So it causes a glitch that the practical outcome is that when you change your rival name at the beginning of the game, the way that you set the rival name affects what animation you get in the Pikachu battle. Because those two regions of memory overlap.
It's interesting. I may have to go back there. So I haven't played through Yellow, and maybe I'll do that at some point, because just little things like that actually make a big difference. But I could see how that could affect basically everything if you're trying to break the game. I assume this gives you some opportunities to do things that you wouldn't normally otherwise be able to.
Oh, just those 30 frames at the beginning of the game. But
okay, just those 30 frames. So what are you?
Well, every when you're trying to shave off every single frame, it matters.
That's a very good point. Yes, I just mentioned a world record by 30-something frames. So
35 frames. Yes. And what's another interesting point is I was talking about this in-game time RTA switch. The 30 frames that are saved are only relevant if you're timing by in-game time, because if you're timing by RTA, then it's too complicated as a human to put in the right name and then delete it to get the outcome you want with this animation. But the in-game time in Yellow doesn't start until after the intro completes. So if you were timing by in-game time, you could save actually even more frames, but completely for free, because you could change the name without being in the timing of the game yet. And then you just have the right animation during the gameplay.
That's something that I actually, and it's going to sound strange, but I didn't discover till about 15 or 20 hours into my playthrough how deep the system actually is with the stats that exist for each Pokemon and things you're going against and all this kind of stuff. And I'm curious, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, why some of those aren't a little bit more forward-facing, and maybe it's just because of the nature of the Game Boy and Gen 1 and Gen 2 and things like that.
Yeah.
Because I would have been nice to know some of these things as I was in battle and stuff like that, but I don't know if they could have done that.
Yeah. I think that a lot of what made Pokemon very popular and what actually worked very well about it is that they didn't make that they didn't make those things forward-facing, because it created a sort of mystery to the game and allure. Like if they just told you, okay, there's these 16 types and they interact in this chart and you have to memorize this chart,
Right.
no kid is going to want to care about that, right?
That's such a good point. Yeah, that sounds awful. Like that sounds like school.
But if you just have that be a thing, and then people it's like, oh wow, I can't do any damage here, or oh wow, I'm doing a lot of damage here, then people are like, oh, that's interesting. I want to figure out why I'm doing so much more damage. And so it kind of pulls you into the game world slowly instead of just like throwing all that data in your face. And then the same thing with there's this thing called DVs, which are like, if anybody here is familiar with Pokemon, it's like the IVs and later gens are worth 2 DVs in the first gen. So DVs are like this hidden way of making Pokemon different. And that's exactly what the developers explained it as, is like, this is how we made Pokemon feel like it's a diverse world where like every Pokemon is not identical. It's like actually in the real world where some Pokemon are big and some Pokemon are small. Some squirrels are big, some squirrels are small in the real world, right? So it makes it feel like an organic world that's not just like the scripted thing that you walk through.
That's really, I think, so important, and it's one of the things that I've finally understood now playing through the game, that I have many friends who played Pokemon games but weren't that big into RPGs, traditional ones or whatever, and I can understand why. Like to that point, there's something that the world feels alive. It feels like it almost feels like that game where you could play through an arcade game, or a traditional platform or whatever, and have the different playthrough because it's so diverse this way. A lot of great RPGs have that same elements, but this one does it in such a forward-facing, simplistic way, if you will, because on the surface, you don't have, it doesn't take you 20 minutes to set up a party. You pick up your game and you go, that kind of thing. And for somebody who kind of is the opposite coming to it, it was an interesting experience because it took me a while to get on board with it and understand and to finally feel a little better about it, to say the least.
For sure.
You mentioned that you were talking with some people in a Pokemon programmers Discord. What kind of things have been developed or tools outside of have there been things that have been developed outside of just a traditional tool-assisted speedrun or something like that for the games?
Yeah, so basically this gets into some of the history I love talking about with the Pokemon speedrunning community, because the whole reason now that we have the tassing ecosystem to be able to console verify any Game Boy and Game Boy Color game is because of the Pokemon speedrunning community and what they did with the emulation of the Gen 1 Pokemon and Gen 2 Pokemon. Basically what happened is when we did that in-game time to RTA switch, now we have the ability to manipulate Pokemon because you can reset in the middle of the run and play perfectly for a couple of seconds. And it's easy to play perfectly if it's only a couple of seconds. It gets harder when you have to play perfectly for several minutes or hours, right? That's not really possible.
Right.
So when we're able to reset and play perfectly for just a couple of seconds and get these perfect Pokemon, then there was this question of, well, how do we find the best perfect Pokemon? Like not just a good perfect Pokemon somebody randomly found one day while trying to figure out how this works, but like, what if we could take a computer and just spray different inputs at the game and find the perfect Pokemon, like the one that is encountered as fast as you possibly could, given how the game works. So the Pokemon speedrunning programmers found an emulator that was kind of close to accurate. Of course, back then, even this is like 2016, even the most accurate Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulators were not perfectly accurate enough for the kind of precision that Pokemon needed with its RNG. So the Pokemon people were invested in this so much that they actually found all the differences left between the emulation that was inaccurate and the way that the console ended up working.
I'm going to pause for just a moment. I'm dropping frames like quite a bit. I just want to make sure. Paul, okay, they were back. Cool. Sorry about that. Are you still with me?
No problem. Yeah,
okay.
For sure.
Okay, so this is fascinating. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, so by looking at each of these individual things, there were a couple things like, how does the BIOS work on different consoles? There's a BIOS on the original brick Game Boy that has this Nintendo logo that drops down really slowly. There's a different BIOS on the Game Boy Color where there's a little flash of color over the blue. Everybody knows that one.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people don't know is that even on the Game Boy Advance, it looks the same, that flash of color over the blue, but there's very, very minute differences in the way that it's programmed to do that give you different RNG. And some games actually use this to be able to detect whether you're on a Game Boy Color or a Game Boy Advance. They use this because there's different like color accuracy of the screen that was used in the Game Boy Color versus the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance was being much more accurate screen, and it's a newer screen. And so they actually programmed it so that, okay, we're going to have these like ridiculously over bright colors sent to the Game Boy Color. But if you're on a Game Boy Advance, you don't need that because the screens were accurate. So we're going to have only slightly over bright colors because the it's still a little inaccurate, right? It's still not a perfect screen.
I appreciate that thoughtfulness, though. That's, I mean, that's, because I definitely can see the differences between the screens. Just, and I'm not a trained eye or anything, but I can see the differences when I'm looking at a Game Boy Color and a Game Boy Advance. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So some of these people were able to use the differences in the BIOS for that, but what we needed to use them for was to know exactly how they worked so that we could get the RNG to line up correctly when you get through the BIOS on a real console versus on the emulator. So when we're playing on GameBat Speedrun now, which is the accurate emulator we use for Gen 1 and Gen 2 Pokemon, we're not actually emulating a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color. We're emulating the Game Boy Advance version of the Game Boy Color because that matches the same thing that you can do on the Game Boy Player console, which is what most of the speedrunning community uses.
Fascinating. My gosh, I have 8,000 questions about this, but we'll try to keep it. So what was the work that went into to develop those type of tools that I mean, how does I guess, I mean, I know you're not looking at source code. I assume maybe you are, but when you try to figure out a BIOS, I mean, that's proprietary stuff. I mean, like how do you go about trying to figure out some of that stuff?
Yes. So officially speaking, we don't look at source code.
Right. Okay.
Now,
yeah, sure.
I'm sure that some people have in the course of this sort of reverse engineering work, but there were ways that people were able to dump the Game Boy Color's BIOS, but not the Game Boy Advance one. But because they're close enough, people were able to look at the outcome of what the BIOSes did to the RNG and infer the changes that must have been made to the code backwards from that.
That had to have been a massive amount of work, just thinking backwards like that.
Yes, it was. I mean, I can go look at logs from like what people were doing to figure that out from the old channels, but
wow. And so that, we've talked about it before, but I think it's important to highlight the end, this console verification process. Why is that then important to what you all are working on, and what exactly is it?
Yes. So now let's just say, assume that all that work is worked out, right? The Pokemon speedrunning team has their emulators working perfectly for Red, Blue, Yellow, and Gold, Silver, Crystal, which are the two games that worked on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. So I think Crystal only worked on the Game Boy Color. It doesn't have that notch that you need to like slide the power switch over on the Game Boy. So once they had that, you got it right there. I've got it.
The card I've played on.
I've got my own stack too. I've got my crystal cartridge. This is the crystal cartridge we used for the verification.
Oh, very cool. That's the actual one. That's great.
Yeah. So, what was I saying? Yes. Once they got the emulator to that state, then there was this question of, okay, the TASBot team does these things called console verifications, where we take a tool-assisted speed run of a game and we try to play it back on the original hardware. So if we have the ability now to emulate a game perfectly because of the work of the Pokemon speedrunning community, can we then take games and adapt the speedruns that have already been done, the tool-assisted speedruns that have already been done, into that emulator, and then somehow spit that out into a way that could be played on a console? So this is kind of where I'm talking about, like, my role has been really just to stitch different tools together. So I worked a little bit with the emulator development scene, getting that stuff perfect. Not too much. I'm not very good with low level code. I'm by day I'm a web developer, so working much more high level in code, but still a little bit enough to understand the general coding concepts. And so when we got that way, there was also the question of how are we going to send this to the console. So there's this guy Extremes. Extremes has been working for years on Game Boy interface. A lot of speedrunner people might be familiar with it already, but if you're not familiar with it, all it does is it replaces the function of the original Game Boy Player's startup disk, where it initializes the Game Boy Player and tells it how to send video out of the GameCube. So Extremes reverse engineered this, built his own version of the startup disk that has better picture quality, better input lag from controllers, all sorts of like various speedrunning niceties. And then once we had that, well, now we have a tool that could also be used to play back inputs arbitrarily, because you no longer have to like use the official disk and then have the inputs come from the controller port. You could have Game Boy interface look at a movie file on an SD card and then send the inputs to the Game Boy player on its own. And the way it does that, so like when you're talking about sending inputs to a console for console verification, you have to have an idea of when the input needs to be sent. Like the person playing the game in the TAS pressed a button at this frame and it got this outcome in the emulator. You need that same exact timing to happen so that you get the same outcome on the console. And the way that the Game Boy interface does that is it watches how much audio has been sent out of the Game Boy player and counts like how many audio samples it's received to see how much time the CPU has been on.
Why is audio as opposed to video? Like, why is that the thing that you're detecting?
So when you have video come out of a console, you only get signal from a video when there's signal from a video. So it's like 60 FPS.
Oh,
audio is much more smaller timing, right? I think the Game Boy and Game Boy player. Actually, I don't know exactly how the Game Boy works on this, but the Game Boy, the GameCube outputs audio at 48,000 hertz.
Right, yeah.
So hertz meaning cycles per second. So if you have a frame per second being 60, then 48,000 is a lot more than 60.
Right. Just a little bit. Yeah, I see exactly where you're coming from.
Yeah, and with these really tight Pokemon TAS timings, you need that sort of precision, because if you press a button even a couple of cycles later or earlier, sometimes that can throw off everything with how tight your timing is for RNG.
And that makes a lot of sense. Like that's a lot more exact, I guess, as you were saying. You can be much more. You're going to need to be, because you were mentioning millisecond. Like the timings are extremely important. It sounds like.
And there's this problem on the Game Boy where its frame rate is not exactly 60 frames per second. It doesn't align perfectly with the GameCube. So even if you were like, oh, let's try to send an input on this frame, you don't even have a concept of that to do that, because in the emulator, it's not even doing that for the input log. Like it, in BizHawk, the way it logs inputs is frame by frame. It says on this frame, this input happens. And the emulator has to actually create like virtual frames for series of blank input where the console doesn't even have frames existing. Like if you think of the handheld Game Boy and Game Boy Color, they have physical LCDs,
right,
and you can turn them off completely and have time where the LCD is never displaying a frame.
Right.
So with that being a thing, then you actually have to have like these blank periods of time that are like a frame to the emulator, but there's arbitrary lengths of cycles.
Oh, geez. That adds some complexity.
Yes, it adds a lot of complexity.
Yeah.
So even if for some reason we wanted to time only to the resolution of a frame, you couldn't do that with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, because that concept doesn't always exist. And so you end up having to time by the cycle to get the right inputs to happen on the right input frames.
That is absolutely fascinating. I'm glad you shared that, because I wonder if that is the same then is that the same for other console verifications other than GameCube, or is that just the way that specifically the GameCube operates?
It's really the way that the Game Boy operates. It's very unique to
Boy.
that situation where you have a handheld that the screen can be completely turned off. In almost every other system, you have a GPU and it's going to output a frame every certain number of seconds, and it's very different in a handheld where it's a pixel processing unit and it's not really caring about what the LCD is doing. It's just trying to do a bunch of math, and if it doesn't get there in time, it doesn't care. It'll move to the next frame. And the key really though is just like if you have the ability to turn the screen completely off, which usually like a PC game, the PC game can't turn your monitor off and just sit there for a minute doing processing and come back on.
Yeah. Exactly.
But a Game Boy game can do that to save power.
It's one of the. I mean, there are some really fascinating and genius things about the Game Boy. That was the one thing. The batteries. So I had a friend who had a Game Gear. I had a Game Boy. My Game Boy seemed like it never died. It was once a month maybe I changed the batteries. And the Game Gear, that thing was done in a couple hours. Because it couldn't take advantage of stuff. Like couldn't take advantage of. It had backlit screen, all that kind of stuff. The Game Boy didn't have any of that.
So talking about all this stuff, like we're just getting into this is the level of precision necessary to take the work that the Pokemon speedrunning community did in getting the emulator that precise, and then translate it to a scene where we want to be sending those inputs to a console at the same level of precision to get the same outcomes.
And I assume this was an iterative process. I'm assuming they had to have taken some development time to figure this out.
Yeah, and we were still working and still are working on the precision of some of the scripts to translate between the emulator and the console, even in the last couple of weeks where we had runs that didn't quite sync up and we didn't know why. And then we had to keep going back to the script and figure out what's wrong with it.
I'm glad you mentioned the Game Boy interface, because it's something I'd been familiar with, but I'd never used it myself because I'm still borrowing a friend's Game Boy and GameCube and Game Boy player. The Game Boy interface is a wonderful tool, and the fact that you don't have to be an expert to set it up. Like it's the interface is like they've just really. It's amazing what the tools can do, because the video screen, just the improvement of video quality is mind blowing. I'm using an S-Video. The GameCube cables are $8,000 at this point. So, for the component cables. I am blown away by what that program can do. And the fact that it fixed my input delay, like everything about it is just really quality stuff. And I'd imagine it was pretty fun to start using that when that thing came around, software came around.
I'm also vaguely connected to a scene called Retro RGB, where they work on that sort of video quality stuff.
Yes.
And the scene there also loved the work that Extremes did with the Game Boy player, because now you have effectively a system where you can recreate the exact 160 by 144 pixels from the Game Boy Color while playing on the original console.
Are you talking about like Retro RGB, like the website?
Yeah, there's a website, Retro RGB, but there's also a Discord for it, and there's a whole scene of people dedicated to that sort of pursuit, making really old consoles still look good on modern LCD screens and hardware.
It's perfect timing because Bob was on the podcast like 2 episodes ago.
Oh, he was?
Yeah. So it's like perfect. Good. Nice
I've talked to Bob a couple of times in the course of different articles and things about Game Boy interface.
His site and specifically his work is how I was familiar with Game Boy interface and how I got down that rabbit hole of trying to improve this, because it's a wonderful tool. I mean, playing on the only thing I wish I had is the actual Game Boy feel of it, because the D-pad on my GameCube controller is not my. Here's the thing. I thought it was really small, and then I go to the Game Boy Advance, and it's like it feels like the exact same D-pad. It's like the same size, but that's a whole other story.
Yeah. And you mentioned the component cables being expensive, but the main thing that people do for that now is the Game Boy. I say Game Boy over and over again, but the GameCube has a digital port that you can plug an adapter into and get native HDMI signal. So you don't have to worry about all the conversion between like a component cable and them being expensive and things like that. So you can get a really pristine signal out of the GameCube with the Carby or Eon GCHD or similar.
Yeah, those things have some really nice quality. And I think like I said, to mention, I'm borrowing this one, but if I ever buy one myself, I think I'm going to go down that road, because the fact that there's a plug and play solution, you don't have to solder or anything like that. That's right up my alley as a non-technical person. So
yeah, I'm also not great at soldering. I have some games that I want to verify in my library right now. I have this stack of Game Boy games right under my monitor to my right here. And some of the games in that stack are not currently soldered very well with the battery, and I need to find somebody who can actually do that repair work and get new batteries in them so that we can do verifications. Because some of the verifications require the save data being held at the beginning of the game.
Ah, okay. Well, there you go. I mean, that's these things have batteries in them. It's the way. Yeah.
That's another aspect of like the work we had to get syncing up the emulator and the console, because the emulator just assumes that the game is in a certain state for its save data starting up. And that assumption is not just wrong, but like horrifically wrong, right? Like it's like when the cartridges ship out of the factory, they don't even have that state. And then when you rewrite, if you want to like clear a save and delete a save, there's no consistency game to game on how the game does that clearing. So like what the emulator assumes to be the default state for a cartridge booting up with its save data is not valid. So to do our verification, often we need to get those things to sync up between the emulator and the console. And so we have to end up writing the save data expected by the emulator to the console before putting the cartridge in and doing the verification.
You know, I that's actually a question I have. So I noticed that the real-time clock, it's checking the cart and not the console itself. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, if you are playing a game that has a real-time clock, then the real-time clock is part of a specific cartridge that has that whole system built into it. So a lot of like old consoles like this, the cartridges can be entire computers on their own and have their own subsystems for doing things.
Got it.
And so like there's a great example of this where somebody played like PC Doom on an NES because they literally put a PC in the cartridge and all it's doing is sending video out of the NES with the outcome of the PC.
That is so awesome. Okay, so then my question is, so this cart was provided to me by a person who she replaced the battery before she sent it to me, and does that clear the real time clock, or is there some? Like, I'm fascinated by how that actually works because when I was playing, I stream at night. I can only play at night, so a lot of the daytime things I didn't get a chance to experience because I was, the game thinks I'm playing at night all the time.
Yeah, it's very odd. I think that the game requires the battery to be working
right.
to like preserve the RTC state
Yeah.
between like turning the console off and on. But then also it's not like it runs when the console is off. It's like as long as the console is running, it can advance the time at a certain rate.
Got it.
But then, and I don't even actually know off the top of my head if it continues advancing after you turn the console off. But in order for it to work, you have to set the time when you turn the game on and like select, it's 10 a.m.
Right.
in the game to match real time.
Oh,
then it'll
yes.
advance even with your...
No, that's go ahead, I'm sorry.
It doesn't have a concept of like what time it is when you start. It only has a concept of trying to advance time at a linear rate.
It's kind of fascinating. I mean, it was unfortunately there were a couple of things that I missed out on because I don't play during the day. So I actually did end up throwing it into the console, maybe stepping away for a lunch break and then playing some Pokemon at lunch while I was working because I was like, I want to know what is it like during the day. It actually looks. I mean, the whole thing. It was really cool what they did with that. I thought that was actually. I thought it was a nice and cool, interesting way to do it. I thought that was. I hadn't experienced that before, so I thought that was really cool. Looking at your speedrun.com profile, when you started working on all these tools, you started doing the tasking, you started doing console verification, all that stuff. Do you still speedrun at all, or have you had any desire to maybe try some RTA stuff anymore?
Yeah, I want to get back and do yellow runs again because I never felt like 100% complete with that, but I haven't done it lately, mostly just because of like finding different interests. One of my interests in the last couple of weeks is there's this new system called libTAS that has been being worked on for a while. Are you familiar with libTAS at all? Have you heard about that?
No. I mean, I've heard the term before. I have no idea what it means.
So typically in the past, PC tasking has been impossible because like you're on a Windows computer, right? Windows is like very secure and very weird in how it does things. So you can't easily like tell a game to stop and advance frame by frame. You can't like hijack all of what it's trying to do and stop it and things like that. So somebody created this thing called libTAS that does that, but it only does it on Linux. So you can do a lot of these tasking things that they used to be impossible, depending on like how you can load the game into Linux or not. So I've been playing Backyard Baseball in libTAS and trying to find a task of it frame by frame.
I love that game, by the way. It's Backyard Baseball, so much fun.
Oh yeah, dude! Yeah. I gotta send you after this the latest task that I have of Backyard Baseball because it's been fun working on. The RTA time for it is 7 minutes and 55 seconds, and the first pass of the task that I did of it at all was 5 minutes and 8 seconds, so like almost 3 minutes faster.
Oh my gosh, I need to see this. There's, I run some golf games, and there's not many of us who do the sports speed running and stuff like that, but there are some really fun and fascinating things you could do, and all different kinds. Lacatech runs Bases Loaded, which is one of my favorite games growing up as a kid. But then seeing it speed run and the things you're trying to do, all the sports games have different requirements and stuff depending on how you run it and stuff. But if you're at all interested, people out there, I'm just saying, consider speedrunning any sort of sport game, because there's not a lot of us that are out there doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, even on TAS videos for a long time, there was like a rule against trying to do sports games because it seemed like, oh, well, if the game just runs on a timer, then what kind of tasking can you do of it? But I think that's kind of like waned a bit as people have become more accepting of different, like diverse tasking and speedrunning scenes. And so now people are much more interested in like, oh, wow, there's this old game and it has this specific implementation of baseball. Let's see what you can do with baseball in this implementation. And it's really great. I love what you can do with backyard baseball and TAS.
It's just the fact that being able to hit like left and right at the same time. There's some really fun things just to show off. Our cool visual moments in the TAS. One of the I love watching TAS. I never get tired of watching them. And part of the fun is also the things where you get to you get to show off and get to do things that just the human can't possibly do. So it's really cool. Have you, at this point, have you gotten a chance to play through all generations, all Pokemon games out there? And if so, do you have some that are some favorites of yours as you've gone through the series and the generations?
I played through Gen 1. I have never entirely played through Gen 2. I never had a cart for it growing up. I'm familiar enough with it now from the speedrunning scene.
Yeah.
But really, I don't enjoy it because I don't have the nostalgia for it.
Right.
It's difficult to. Gen 3 is the game that I almost certainly have put the most hours into because Ruby and Sapphire were like the games I had and played a lot growing up. So yeah, I would probably, if I had to pick a gen that's my favorite, I would say the Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, because I felt like those were the best designed games. They had like the most replay value and the most extended things you could do with like finding Latios and Latias in the battle tower and the battle pyramid, especially in Emerald. Those are just massive games. And then I played through Gen 4 and I liked Gen 4, Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, but around that time is when I stopped. So I don't have any experience with Heart Gold, Soul Silver, XY. I played Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire, and I played Black and White, but only briefly. I haven't played Black, White 2, and then I haven't played much of Sword Shield, but I did play through Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu, and I felt like what they did with Gen 1's like Kanto's environment in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee was like really good.
The Gen 3 thing is actually where I'm probably going next. It's besides the chat mentioning how much fun and how well they the same thing you just mentioned, how well they're designed, just to the really wonderful games. It sounds like I think it's probably where I'm going next. And they're still, you can get carts for very reasonably priced. Like, it's one of those things. I'm glad and fortunate at the same time that Pokemon has been as popular as it is, because there are carts out there. There's ways to play these games that still today, thankfully.
Yeah, I felt like the art of Gen 3 really is like one of the best examples of how you can make a game look good despite it being a very small pixel art screen. It's only like a 240 by 160 screen, and yet it looks like a totally modern game, like you might see like Stardew Valley.
Right, yeah,
it has
exactly.
Similar graphical fidelity to like Ruby Sapphire.
That's kind of the way I felt a lot about this, why games of this ilk in this time period. I point to the Super Nintendo a lot. Like Super Metroid is a game where it still looks, sounds, everything about it. Yes, it's a classic and it's retro and all those kind of things, but it still holds up. It's so much fun to play, and you don't have to think, oh man, I'm playing an old game. The controls are great, everything, And I think the Gen 3 is from what I'm understanding, because I haven't played it yet, a lot of people have been saying the same exact thing, that it's like you don't feel like you're playing a game from 20 years ago or whatever.
It's like it's fully 60 FPS. And people are even now, like, you got a new game, does it run at 60 FPS? Does Cyberpunk run at 60? No, dude. Pokemon Ruby runs at 60 FPS. I don't worry about it.
Yeah, tell me exactly. You don't see frame drops in that thing. Okay. Well, that's really cool, and I'm glad that you still do get a chance to play some of the the modern games and everything, because the Pokemon's showing no signs of slowing down. If anything, with the remakes coming out and everything like that, there's just the never-ending supply of Pokemon out there at this point.
Yeah.
Do you what are some of your favorite Pokemon from your history of playing?
Oh, I've got to talk about like Swampert, right? Because that was a big thing being on Ruby. If you're grinding through Ruby or Sapphire another time to get a new Latias or get a new Groudon and try to get different uh, stats or shinies or whatever, like the the experience playing through a Swampert in that game is really good because it feels like it's versatile enough to handle almost every scenario, but it challenges you to figure out how to do it at the same time. Like you might have to go to the underground ship, or what even is it called? There's like a ship that's hidden. You have to dive to between two cities that's like totally out of the way, and it has ice beam on that ship. And Swampert can learn that, but it's like you have to go through that whole dungeon and find it to get there. And then once you have that, you can actually fight grass types effectively, whereas you couldn't through the whole rest of the game.
That seems like a pretty important get.
Yeah. So there's a lot of complexity like that to the Swampert design that I like, where it's good, it's almost too good, but it gives you that sort of like environment where you have to explore a lot to get to that point.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to finding that stuff. And then the real question has been kind of at this point, do I wait for the remake or do I just go ahead and dive in? But I think I want to dive in because it sounds fun. It sounds like a great experience.
Yeah, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. Do you have a capture card for a 3DS?
I know, but I've hacked mine so I can Wi-Fi it, and it actually works at 30 frames a second.
Oh, you have the NTR.
Yeah, it actually works pretty darn well because I have a good internet connection here. I have a good Wi-Fi setup, so the 30 frames is totally fine for streaming.
Nice. In the speedrunning scene, that's a different category in the leaderboards than the hardware cap card.
Yeah,
because it has to overclock the console. I guess not necessarily overclock, but it has to run it at the new 3DS clock rate.
Oh,
and then get like that extra bandwidth to do the streaming of the video,
right?
And then have the game play with the rest of the CPU's bandwidth. So it actually plays the game at a different like frame rate, and even sometimes faster frame rate to have it unlocked like that.
Interesting. I had no idea, but that makes sense. I mean, that seems very reasonable anyway, especially if you're playing. I mean, you can't that can't be on the same leaderboard, especially with times as competitive as they are.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the scene has worked that out. Where it used to be like, oh, you have to go get the hardware set up, and it's really like prohibitive because they don't make them all the time, and it might be a couple $100.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my shit! I was bummed to see when it went away, and this is actually working good enough for what I do, so I think I'm gonna stick with it. But it would be nice to have that capture card in the future at some point. Big Bass mentioned SS Cactus, by the way, is the name of the ship.
Mm-hmm. Oh, the abandoned ship SS Cactus is a great place if you have a Swampert to find Ice Fiend. Anyway, that does get a little bit past where my like console verification interests are to get into like the DS 3DS scene, but it's almost on the cutting edge. I would say the cutting edge is more like the research in the GBA platform right now, because with GB and GBC being so tightened down, GBA should be on the horizon for something we can start to tighten up there. But there's also some efforts being done on DS and 3DS. Citra is starting to get task tools. I don't think they're quite working great yet, but you can do it a little bit for 3DS. And DS has had great ones with Decimoon for a long time. So there are plenty of tasks available of things like Pearl, Diamond, and Platinum.
You know, that brings up an interesting question. You mentioned console verification for the GBA in terms of what's on the GameCube and what's on the Game Boy Player. Mm-hmm. Is there console verification for the actual Game Boy Advance itself?
Yes, it's the problem with it is that emulation side really more than anything.
Got it, okay.
So the exact same pipeline used to do verifications of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games is used for Game Boy Advance.
Okay.
But it works better for Game Boy and Game Boy Color because the emulator is so much more accurate for that older system.
Got it.
And then it gets more complex in the era of the Game Boy Advance. And so the additional complexity makes it more difficult to emulate accurately. So we have like 3 movies that have been verified on Game Boy Advance, I think. I did one with
start.
Oh, what's his name? Colin, Easy Games 69 from the task scene. We verified Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3 on the GBI and Game Boy Player platform.
Oh my gosh.
But that was, even that, and it being like a very well emulated game, it was still off by a couple frames here and there. And we had to do some work to get it to sync up properly.
I'm really familiar with Colin because he's tasked a bunch of games that I speedrun, and I'm forever thankful for some of the things. I'm a TurboGrafx-16 speedrunner, and he's done a fair amount of those games, and I'm forever thankful. This is once again why I'm just forever indebted to Tassers, because finding things and doing things that I hadn't thought about or didn't know were possible. Because yes, a lot of time there are times where tasks do things that people can't do, but it does inspire you to try some things maybe you didn't try before quite often, and you would be surprised sometimes what you could accomplish just by looking at those things. So very, very cool, man. That's the reason I asked about the Game Boy Advance is because as a player, we're seeing a lot of things being done out there for us. The consolizer, Analog's coming out with a new console that you can play Game Boy Advance games on, and the fact that there are these new and exciting ways that we can continue to love and play our Game Boy Advance is a console I'm just forever in love with. It's exciting on our side of things, and the fact that you're doing work for it and stuff, it's very cool that people are doing work for it.
I would put out a word of caution to anybody familiar with the consolizer that you have to get a specific firmware to do the speedrunning on it, because it runs at the wrong frame rate otherwise. But beyond that, it is it's great, and it runs just as well as doing Game Boy interface.
When we did the GDQ show, one of the things that I was my big primary takeaways was about running as much as you can in our current state, in our current configurations on the Game Boy player on GameCube, because it's accurate for Game Boy. I mean, you've got multiple generations of consoles and games that it can be accurate for. And man, I got to tell you, it's kind of changed my life playing games on it. It just feels, it just feels and looks so much better than the other things I've been using before. So. It's pretty cool. So for yourself, you mentioned you would like to return to at some point some Pokemon Yellow speedrunning. Anything else? Do you play modern games? Anything else you'd like to try in the future, moving forward in your gaming life?
I've got to get back more again into the old school RuneScape speedrunning scene.
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar with old school RuneScape speedruns?
Absolutely. Okay. I'm totally drawing something, but yes, I love watching them. They're fun.
So that scene is really big in some ways and small in others. So old school RuneScape is a really big game as an MMO, and it has a lot of people doing different speed trials of things like trying to beat bosses quickly, but they don't have the same usual speed run perspective of starting from a set state often, because people are usually playing on these end game accounts that would take years to recreate. So there is a smaller speedrunning scene that tries to do things like get through to the Champions Guild as fast as possible. But also because it's an MMO, the game is constantly evolving, and our routes for things are constantly falling back out of date. So one thing I always want to do is go back and re-refine the route as it's changed for the latest game patches.
I'd be remiss to ask before we wrap this thing up about your screen name. I found some interesting info reading your bio on the TASVideos.org website. How did you get your screen name? What is this amalgamation of things?
Yeah, so the TI-83 comes from the TI-83 calculator, which is a classic calculator for programming. It's a great way to get into programming if you're not very familiar with it, because the programming language is very similar to English. It almost reads like reading English to read code for it. And it also, as somebody who is very interested in code golf, is a hilarious language. Are you familiar with code golfing?
No.
Okay. So
awesome.
There's this thing that programmers do sometimes called code golfing, where you take a language and you say, what's the fewest number of characters that you can write in this language to make this thing happen? And so it becomes it's almost like a speedrunning competitive scene for coding.
That's really cool, actually. That's a fun idea. Fun way to, first of all, to probably learn more efficient code, I would assume.
Yeah. It makes you don't necessarily want to write that efficient in a production environment, because you might be naming your variables A or I or something, and then nobody's going to be able to read your code, and then you're going to have a bad time. But it's fun from a competitive perspective. And I actually did a task once where I did a task of a TI, because one of the chords in BizHawk is a TI-83 calculator.
That's awesome.
And so I have a task where it takes a game and says, I'm going to recreate this game to this number of parameters. And then I'm going to program that game on the calculator in the task, and then play the game that was programmed.
Oh, that's so wild. That's so meta.
Yeah, it was a great little meta experiment. So that was one of my more favorite projects. But that, so the part of the name comes from that, and having some records and TI-83 golfing and other like I just really enjoy working in the TI-83 language because I think it's like a classic of the whole history of programming in general.
Sorry, finish.
The other half is the Kevin was a name of one of my friend's cousins who had a Pokemon Emerald cartridge. So often playing Pokemon growing up, I would be playing under the screen name Kevin. And so I just combined those two things into the TI-83 and Kevin.
It worked really well, but it reminded, reading the bio, I was like, man, the TI-83, I had one of those when I was in high school or whatever and I'm not very good at coding and programming, but I do understand some very, very, very basic level stuff. And one of the ways I learned is, for some reason, I could never get my link cable to work. So I couldn't just download a program from somebody else or from my computer. So quite often I was sitting there inputting every single, command, or every single line of code. But I was like, oh, well, why does this? And if you messed up something, just a simple syntax or something, like that, I'd have to kind of diagnose it myself. But it taught me a little bit about how the calculator worked and how the programming language, which to me seemed a little bit kind of like basic, but even like simpler at the time. So
exactly. So I was saying it's almost like reading English because it's even simpler than basic.
It really was, but I have some very fond memories of Tetris and even some Mario games and some other things that you could actually get to work on a TI-83. It was quite remarkable, especially at the time before, I didn't have a cell phone or anything. So this is the late 90s, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is mind blowing, the games that I can play. Although then I looked at the Game Boy and the Game Boy was infinitely more better, but whatever, like one of those things. So
for sure.
Very cool, very much. And I appreciate, all this. You mentioned it briefly, but that, you have a background and you continue to work in development, web development. And so the things that you do, it's always interesting. I find that people who are developers and things like that also do the speedrunning thing. And we are so thankful for them in our community, because we wouldn't be able to have some of the things we have unless you brought that kind of technical knowledge and expertise to the community, to these games. So pretty cool that you have that background and that you choose to use it on gaming and speedrunning and stuff like that.
Yeah. And if I can talk a bit more about those tools before I wrap up here.
Please, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that we've been working on for the TASBot team is, for a very long time when TASBot was doing events, we would build this script for an event, and then we just kind of like have it on one of Dwango's computers somewhere, or like on a GitHub repo. And it wasn't really like publicly accessible or obvious, like how to recreate it yourself at home. Which also can hurt us, right? Because if we want to take a task again for the same system in the future, then we have to go dig up again. How do we build tasks for that system? How do we even do that, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things I've been working on is a new archive for the TASBot scene specifically, called runs.tas.bot. And if you go there is a list on the page, runs.tas.bot/runs. There's a little runs button at the top of the page, and then you can like click different consoles, and it shows the like all of the task archives that we have available for those consoles. So if you like go in and click GB and GBC, it has a list of like 38 or so games.
Oh, what a wonderful resource. Holy cow, this is great, TiKevin.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And so I assume this will be updated as, more new runs kind of get out, but this is for archival purposes. This is wonderful.
Yeah, it's really cool, and it's really helpful because I can just go here if I want to like do another verification or recreate one for an event. All I have to do is go on this website and click download verification data, and I can play the tasks on my Game Boy player.
And wow, sorry, I'm getting enamored by the site here now. There was there's a PC, the Genesis 32X Genesis, and this is so cool. Mm-hmm. This had to have taken some time.
Yeah. It took a lot of work building out like how I was going to develop this as a web developer too, and some of the architecture for it I really enjoy talking about. If you know anybody who does like a web development podcast.
Right, I want to give guess. I'm going to find one because this is fascinating. It's the type of thing where the simplicity of it, I'm just clicking around. I don't have to do any sort of input. I can just drill down and then if I want to get more detailed, this is great, man. This is so cool.
Thank you. So I've been working on that site so that we have archives of TASBot's past efforts and archives of how to task different consoles. You can see also at the top are those like console guides, and if you click on each of those, it'll like take you to a page that explains the process for taking a task and doing a TASBot console verification of that run.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, and then you have yes, and it leads you on to the GitHub. There's Onosaurus's. Sorry, once again, I'm just getting geeked out by all of the info that you can have access to so easily.
Yeah, some of the pages aren't like fully built out, and they just point to Onosaurus's repo where we don't have enough information on the site yet, but it's being actively developed.
And I know it's the thing. It's when when there's so many people involved, but like a lot of volunteers. This is the thing that these are our passion projects. So they take. When Dwaygo was on the podcast, we talked a little bit about TASVideos.org. I still get a little chuckle when I visit it because it feels like when I started visiting it 10 years ago, and it's but it has all the info. It's all there. It's
yeah.
It's
my main thing there is trying to get them on HTTPS, but we'll get there.
It's small steps, right? Small steps. Just keep it secure.
Yeah. And then in that same vein, like to talk quickly about
please
the why is like, so we're building all these archives not just to have the archives of TASBots work, but then there's an aspect of I talked a bit about how we had to like figure out what was going on in the BIOS to make Pokemon speedrunning accurate enough. But there's this whole like larger scene of that where we build these test ROMs for behavior that we want to make this emulator on the console match the emulator. And part of this console verification scene actually is a whole new like way of looking at the test ROM scene. So not just like, does this behavior from this very, very specific thing being tested by this ROM match the console? Now we can think, does this entire game's behavior match the console between the emulator and the Game Boy player by doing these sort of verifications and having these tests available? So it's almost like thinking of a whole new way of looking at emulator development and making sure your emulator is running accurately.
The tools. My understanding is that the tools that you create to do these things are nearly as important as actually creating the runs themselves. Because we're going. I love that we're in a place where we're going for as perfectly accurate as we can be, and I don't mean that I mean it in the literal sense of perfect, like trying to get the exact bits and bytes or whatever you call it. I mean, I'm still just constantly blown away by the amount of work that's being put into this. Mm-hmm. So
yeah. The console verification scene has that double benefit of both showing these awesome TASs on the original hardware and giving the broader speedrunning scene access to TASing and showing what these cool things are that we can do. It also has that secondary benefit of improving the emulation scene and all these people who love developing emulators and giving them new processes to make accurate emulators.
Absolutely, and I think I'm not BizHawk. I'm constantly blown away how accurate I can be with BizHawk as an emulator, and all all the other work that's being done in different types of emulators. But the once again the accuracy that we've gotten it down to, where it's replicating the specific lag I have playing Super Mario Brothers 3, exactly how it happens on the console. Just it makes the game. It reminds me. It puts me in that, and it's just a huge appreciation for it.
Yeah, and I shouldn't oversell it too much because it's kind of a unique situation with the NES and the Game Boy and Game Boy Color being able to be that accurate because those systems are so simple relative to more modern systems. If you think of like a modern CPU, a lot of people don't even know this, but like a modern CPU you have in your like desktop or laptop isn't even running the same way that every time it runs code. Because what it'll do is it'll look at the code that's coming through and say, oh, that was an interesting way to do that. Well, I wonder if I run the code this way, if I can run it faster next time. And so there's actually like little AI bits inside the processor to run your code that you're sending to it faster and faster every time it goes through.
Huh. That's so interesting because there are times where I'm wondering what I'm on a new computer. I'm about 2 months into a new computer, and I'm getting this feeling like some things are happening. I video edit, like my video editing processes seem like they've been running a little bit better recently. And I know there's updates to the software and everything like that, but I've always wondered if that's something that actually happens, and it sounds like it is. That's happening on the operating system level, huh?
It's so much deeper even than the operating system level. It's like built. Wow. It's things that are built into the chips at like a firmware level of trying to make things just like micro bits faster. So like these newer consoles, as you get past like the N64 and GameCube era, start to be so like modern that they aren't even acting deterministically anymore. And then there's not even a concept of like, how could you build a task of this? Because there's no there's no two playthroughs of the game that would look
Right.
identical ever in any system. And then we have systems like libtask that sort of like step back and say, whoa, okay, well, let's ignore that and let's just limit the game to play at this specific rate. And
Which works perfect if you're trying to create a task for something. So,
yeah.
Kevin, TiKevin, thank you so much for sharing all of these things. I feel like we could do 10 more episodes, just going by some of the things that you're involved with. And but I appreciate you breaking it down for somebody like me who's not always the most technical, but also for people who listen and watch, because it's really fascinating the work that's being done quite often by people who aren't necessarily front facing or public facing, because as we mentioned before, a lot of times tasking is done single kind of on your own type of thing. It's an individualistic thing. So the fact that we can actually hear about some of these stories is really insightful, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
So
a great example of that sort of collaboration was when we did the verification of Donkey Kong for the Game Boy. We ran into some emulation inaccuracies still just even a couple of months ago, and we're able to work with the TASer of the Donkey Kong 94 game for the Game Boy to build different versions of it and figure out exactly what was going on the console level.
Okay, so far, so DK93 I only discovered like a year ago. One of the best games on Game Boy, like Barn. Such a wonderful game. What was different about it? That like why did that? What kind of things did it uncover or reveal?
Yeah, that game does something called using uninitialized RAM. So usually when a game starts up, it says, "Oh, there's all this RAM available to me. I'm going to set it to something constant so that I know what's going on with it. Like set it all to zeros or ones or the highest number possible." On the flip side, what this game does is it ignores all that and says, "I'm just going to use that as a way of making things random," which it's like almost like a quantum effect, like what state the electricity in the RAM might be when you turn on the console. You really have no idea where it is. So that's not a great thing to do usually, because it's very it's not great to not know what your game is going to do when you run certain code.
I'm sure.
But they almost like used that as a way of building a sort of RNG. So we had to then once we were able to identify that that's what it was doing, that it was reading from a place of the RAM that is not possible to know what the number is in like reality. We were able to then backtrack and say we can write to that before even starting the game, and then swap cartridges, put in the Donkey Kong cartridge, and play the task back.
Oh wow! That's so interesting. That's fascinating. So I guess you're creating a state that would I understand. Okay, now I'm understanding. Very cool. And I assume it was success. Was it able to work that way?
Yep. Once we were able to make that state constant, like writing to all of the RAM before swapping in the Donkey Kong cartridge, we were able to get it to play back 100% successfully.
Very cool. A good scene, by the way. DK94 has a good speedrunning scene as well. If anybody's interested, there's some really interesting stuff happening RTA-wise speedrunning in DK94. So very cool. If anybody was interested in these kind of things, where would be like a good place to start? Where would you send them if somebody wanted to get involved with maybe the tools or any of that kind of stuff? It was with console verification, but also tasking, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Let me see. It was yes. So if you go to runs.tas.bot, that site that I have, it probably has the best links available for this kind of thing, because it has links out to the TASBot Discord at the top. Perfect. And it has the link out to the tas.bot site, which again has like a ton of links out to different places, like TAS Videos. TAS Videos has a link to their Discord, I'm sure, somewhere on their site. There is a TAS Videos Discord too. So basically the way that the breakdown works for this is, if you're interested mostly in like making TASes and not so much whether or not they play on hardware, then you want to go to TAS Videos, because TAS Videos has the best people for helping you learn how to make TASes. Well, then the TASBot community is where you want to go if you're more interested in this, like, all these TASes exist and I want to see them play back on original consoles. Then you go to the TASBot community, you can work on that kind of thing.
So cool. That's actually very helpful to distinguish between the two as well. That's great. And all of that, runs.tas.bot, great place to go. If anybody wants to see some of you on Twitch or follow you, some of your stuff, where can people follow you if they're interested?
Yeah, I think the best way to do that is just to point towards my YouTube channel. If you search TiKevin83 speedruns on YouTube, there's a whole bunch of videos from myself. And in the description of all those videos, I have links to a ton of different places you can find me on Twitter, my Discord, Twitch, YouTube, like the YouTube homepage for my channel. All that stuff is available there. So yes, if you find me TiKevin83 speedruns on YouTube and go to a description of any video, you should see links to all of the different places you can watch me.
I also want to give a quick shout out for that. It was very helpful in doing some research. You've got some great commentary videos that you do over the console verifications, and so interesting. I promise folks you will not be disappointed. Just pick one and go watch it if you're at all interested in any of this, because I've got on the stream, if you're watching the stream or the video right now, this is the one for Pokemon Blue, but they're really interesting, and I'm glad you talked through the process, and it's a really great way to learn, but also see what's like all these interesting things that have been done to get what you're seeing on screen at the time.
Yeah, if you're interested in Pokemon Gen 1 tasking, I think those are the best videos you can find out there right now. Is the video on the blue glitchless tasks and the yellow glitchless tasks have really good commentary, and I think I'm actually going to build a new commentary with some co-hosts soon for the yellow glitchless tasks. So that'll be a thing on the horizon to watch out for. They're
really interesting, really fun, really I mean, there's just so much going on. It's really good stuff. I'm glad you did them. They're really awesome. So great place to send people, and I'll include it in the description of this podcast.
Cool. And you get a bit more raw look when you watch a lot of the other verifications, like the verifications of various things that we've done on my Twitch, and then I'll push them over to YouTube. You get kind of like the raw perspective of, oh, that's the kind of stuff it takes to get something verified on a console.
Absolutely. The amount of effort and work it takes to make it happen. TiKevin83, thank you so much for taking some time. I really do appreciate it. This has been fascinating, to say the least, and I appreciate your passion for Pokemon, but also for what you're doing and stuff like that. So thank you for everything you're doing out there, but also thanks for taking the time to share it with us. This is really a lot of fun and perfect timing, because I've just been binging some Pokemon recently. So it's perfect timing for this. Awesome. Thanks again. Thanks everyone for listening, watching, viewing, liking, subscribing, and sharing. All of that stuff goes a long way to helping out the podcast. If you'd like any additional info, you can go to sequencebreakpodcast.com. All of our past episodes, everything's on there. You'll find everything there. If you'd like to watch live, follow the Sequence Break Twitter. That is Sequence Break PC, and you can join in, ask some questions, watch the whole thing live. It does happen. It's not really a set time, but I do post when I go live. Everything else, if you have any questions or anything like that, podcast at sequencebreakpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.